Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the People's Assembly broadcast. Whether you're watching Facebook, good evening, everyone. I think we're live now. Welcome to the People's Assembly broadcast. You're watching on Facebook, on our channel, on Twitter, whether in your front room, your workplace, wherever you are. I hope you're all safe and well. I'm Shelley. I'm a Health and Safety Policy Officer at the TUC in my day job, but tonight I'm filling in for the fantastic Laura Pidcock. Unfortunately, she's busy tonight and can't fulfill her usual hosting duty. The best I can in her absence. We're going to be talking about work and health and safety tonight. And while we may still be in a national lockdown, millions of people continue to go out to work every day. And the role that health and safety management plays in workplaces could not be more crucial. I'm sure many of you will have seen some of the shocking and sobering data released this week. A release by the Office for National Statistics showed us that those in some of the lowest paid and most insecure types of work are most at risk of dying from COVID-19, with more than 25 different jobs where the fatality rate is more than double what it is for the general working age population. Bakers, butchers, garment workers and chefs are among those that are worst affected. And this week we've also seen that number of deaths pass 100,000, and it's just an awful milestone. More than 100,000 grieving families, friends and colleagues. And I have to say, when Boris Johnson said, we've done everything we can, I took an intake of breath because I just, how dare they say that when we know there are so many things that we as a trade union movement, as activists, have been calling for months to improve this situation, whether it be sick pay or an inquiry on PPE failures, more enforcement on workplace health and safety, all of which I'm sure we'll cover tonight. And because despite the lockdown, the number of COVID outbreaks that we're seeing in workplaces is higher than it has been at any point in the pandemic. And yet what we hear about is, is the number of individuals being fined for breaking rules or throwing parties or having a coffee with their friends in the park, but not the bosses who are breaking the rules and putting working people in harm's way. And it's abundantly clear that most of the risk is being shouldered by working class people with no other option but to continue going out to work every day. What to do about it? How do we keep workers safe? What are the priorities for union activists at this time? All of that we'll be covering in the next hour, and I'm really glad to be joined by some great guests this evening. Roger, Rebecca, Kevin and Wayne, who I'll each invite to say a few words before we move to some questions and discussion. And first of all, I'm going to go to one of my trade union colleagues. He represents members in Britain's largest union, with key workers who've continued going out throughout this pandemic. I know he can't stay with us, unfortunately, for the whole night, so that's why I'm coming to you first. He's the Assistant General Secretary of Unison, Roger Mckenzie. Roger, over to you.
Thank you so much, Shelley, and thanks everyone for the opportunity to join you this evening. I want to start with a bit of context first. So just over 100,000 souls who've been lost because of this pandemic, and those are 100,000 people who died in hospital. It's not the full range of people who've died. It's the people who've died in hospital. Many more have died in their own homes because of this pandemic. 100,000 real people with real families, with real lives that have been lost. When you put that against the second largest continent on the planet, Africa, with 56 countries, they have lost 84,000 tragic lives. And, you know, this government has a lot to answer for, frankly. I really don't know how these Tories sleep at night, frankly, that 100,000 people have died. Now, what we know is that many of our members have been put in harm's way during this pandemic. I remember an occasion last year where after George Floyd was murdered so tragically, I was asked to take a knee with one of our branches to commemorate, to protest that death. And what they said to me beforehand was, we're going to take a knee. When you take a knee, we're going to read out all the names of the Unison members that we know of who've died during this pandemic. We were on our knee for some considerable time. And what was also really frightening was the number of those names that were very clearly either of African or Asian descent. Now, obviously, my name's not particularly African descent. You know, you can't really tell. So there may well have been many others who were also part of that number. But it was scary, one of the most moving moments for me of the whole time. And I know that I wasn't alone. The part for my contribution, the main part of my contribution, what I want to really concentrate on is the mental health aspect of this, because what we are seeing is the continuing mental health problems that are being experienced by particularly care workers in private care homes, many of whom have been kind of instructed that you have to go and sleep in at some of these homes. And if you don't sleep in at some of these homes, then you will lose your job. When they're already struggling to put bread on the table. That's more than coercion. In some cases, that's knowing full well. That was knowing full well that people did not have the personal protective equipment for them, but people were still being instructed to put themselves in harm's way. But effectively, it was the employer putting people in harm's way. What we also have seen, though, is that those people are scared. Those people don't just have that fear in the workplace, they take that home with them as well. And their families are then concerned, where they're not being forced to sleep in, but many of our members are being told, have that, you know, are worried about what happens to their loved ones who are going out to work every day. Will they see them again? Or if they come back, will they come back with this virus that they might pass on to everybody else? Or worst of all, that they'll die of that virus. What we also know is that the amount of times that our members, our activists, there's a real burden on our activists over this. Many of our activists, for the very first time, are having to deal with people who are dealing with real bereavement. but also having to deal with people who are just really, really scared for their lives in the workplace. And, you know, that is scary. That is a really big issue for us. So what we have to do is to provide real support for those members, for those workers who are having to deal with those sort of things for the first time. I have to tell you, many of our health service members who have, you know, dealing with bereavement is not a new thing for them, but the extent of the bereavement really is. It's a really big issue. So not only do we have to provide support as a trade union movement for our members in these really often really dangerous situations that they're being asked to go into, but what we also have to do is to give much more support to our reps, much more support to activists who are facing these things for the first time. So what's at the bottom of this before my time's up that we can really make sure that we do? I mean, at the end of the day, and I'm sure all the other speakers will kind of underline the same thing. At the end of the day, it's really about how strong we are organized in the workplace that is going to make a difference. If we're not strong, as we're not, frankly, within areas of social care, then what is really, really clear from this pandemic so far is the way that employers have exerted themselves, have exerted their power in the workplace over workers who haven't got enough union protection. So we have to prioritise, and we have done within Unison. We've prioritised organising in social care. We must build power for working people within the workplace to stop these employers who are exploiting our members, exploiting working people so they can't get away with this stuff. That must be a priority for us. And I have to say as well, if we're really interested in a national care system, as we are, I think it's really difficult to build an effective national care system when we have so much of the private sector involvement in the delivery of social care. When I first started as a rep many, many years ago in the early 1980s for the National Union of Public Employees, I was a shop steward representing people in care homes. All of those care homes were publicly run. Now care homes are 90% plus run by the private sector. That's something that we have to deal with. The profit motive must be removed from the delivery of social care, in my view. But the key thing for me is the need to build strong, effective trade union organisation across the public sector, across social care, because that's fundamentally the thing that's going to make a difference. One little further piece, if I may, and that's this thing about vaccination nationalism that I really think we have to tackle as well. All the rich nations of this world are buying up all the vaccines, and we are hearing that nations in the global south, many of them are estimating that they're going to have to wait till 2023 until they get vaccinated. If there was ever an occasion where the message needs to get home to everybody, that what happens to somebody on the other side of the world has an impact on all of us, this is it. This is a time for real effective international solidarity as well. I'll leave it there. Thank you, comrades. Good luck to you all. And thanks very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Roger, for that. It's really great to hear from you. I'm really pleased that you mentioned, we're getting some applause, it's a shame we can't hear it. You mentioned mental health at the beginning there, which is so key because it's obviously, and we're going through a mental health crisis as it is, but COVID has really exacerbated that, whether it's stress due to the level of workload, particularly in the health and care sectors, or people feeling isolated or suffering from bereavement, as you mentioned. What kind of support should we be pushing for in terms of, mental health support for workers? And then there's another question that's been posted in the comments here from Helen, which I'm just going to put on the screen. And she asked, what do you think about the impact of unpaid periods of quarantine on the low-paid migrant workers, which I know many Unison members are, who travel home? So the government's talking about this period of quarantine for people who go abroad and then come back. Presumably that would be for 10 days completely unpaid. So what should we be demanding in that context?
Well, I mean, thanks for the question, Helen, because I think that's a really, really good question, and it's scandalous that people who are already struggling to survive. Remember, many of these workers are not just doing one job; they're doing 2 or 3 jobs just to survive. And part of the equation also is the fact that many workers in social care, many migrant workers in particular, are being told you can only have one job. Right. So if they're being penalized during that as well, that's something that we really have to raise our voices about. Now, I mean, for me as an organizer, one of the key things about this is that you can't just be shouting from the outside. The thing that will really make a difference is building workers' power in the workplace. That's what makes the difference. So we have to raise our voices against incidents like Helen's just brought to our attention. But we have to build power for working people to come together so that those things don't happen. In terms of what we do for around mental health, I think that what we shouldn't be doing, first of all, is trying to turn our shop stewards, trying to turn our activists into overnight bereavement counsellors, or kind of experts in counselling or something. That's not what a shop steward does, right? Shop steward's a friend in the workplace for sure, but they're not counsellors. This is something that we need to, I think, on occasion where we can, if we can work with the employer to come to some joint arrangements so that people can get proper counselling, then that's something that we should do. But, I think it's something that we have to look at within the trade unions. It's certainly something that we're looking at within Unison to provide ongoing support, because the key thing for this, the key word that I've just said there is ongoing support. This stuff will not go away. This stuff is going to stay with people for a long, long time. So this is the sort of support that we need to make sure is ongoing for a period of time, but is there when our members need it, but also there when our activists need it as well.
Thanks, Roger. I think that's absolutely key point about, union reps aren't there to provide the support. We're there to make sure the bosses are doing it. I know you've got to leave us, so thank you so much for being here tonight. Really, really great to have you, and stay safe. Hope to see you soon.
Yeah, you all too. Thanks a lot. Cheers.
Thank you. I'm next going to come to a colleague of mine who heads up the Organising and Services Department at the TUC, and he also sits on the board of the Health and Safety Executive, which oversees much of the regulation and enforcement of health and safety in workplaces. It's Kevin Rowan from the TUC. Kevin, the screen is yours.
Thanks very much, Shelley, and thanks to the People's Assembly for organising tonight's event and for allowing me to come along and join you for the discussion. I'm going to start with a few things about what we know. What we know right now is that there are many, many more people going to work in normal workplace kind of working conditions than in the first lockdown. There's less employers taking advantage of the furlough system. More people are having to go to work in this lockdown period. Whether that's driven by insecurity, we know that more people are being made redundant, fear of unemployment. We certainly know that more employers are discouraging people and not enabling people to work from home. So we know that there's more people at work taking risks. Secondly, we know from Public Health England data that evidence of workplace outbreaks, clusters of COVID infections, are growing at a really phenomenally scary rate, more or less trebled in the last 4 weeks. And that's not us scaremongering as a TUC or anybody who's got a particular axe to grind. That's Public Health England data that says workplace outbreaks of COVID are trebling. And that's situations where the one common factor around people getting infected is where they work. And thirdly, as both Shelley and Roger have said, that tens of thousands of people are dying, and we've seen the latest figures tonight around people who are dying from COVID-related infections. Tens of thousands of them working people. And we know from the ONS data last week that there are common factors among the kind of people, the kind of workers who are dying from COVID. And the things that are linking those workers are they have public-facing jobs, and many of them. Many of them are low-paid workers. Many of them are in insecure work, and many of them don't get access to decent sick pay provision. And just to follow Roger's point from the his comments around the care sector, round about 20% of care workers get zero pay if they self-isolate or go on the sick. You don't even qualify for a measly statutory sick pay allowance. So these are all factors that are contributing towards the kind of scale of the impact of COVID on working people. So my conclusion from that, what we know, is that workplace safety has to be a factor. It just has to be. It can't be just a coincidence that all those things are happening and we're seeing working people being killed through this pandemic. So that's what we know. What we hear, and I was at a HSE board meeting this week, what we hear from the health and safety executive, and they've done 90,000 spot checks and inspections, is that employers are getting it right. That 80% of employers have got it right from day one. About a further 18-19% get it right with a little bit of advice and guidance. And a tiny minority of employers are not getting it quite right. And they've served, I think, 200, more or less 200 improvement notices out of the 6 million employers that are operating in the UK today. What we hear from our reps and from our members is that half of the workplaces that they're in aren't practicing social distancing. Around half of them have got problems with the adequacy of their personal protective equipment, and around half of them haven't seen a COVID secure risk assessment. That's what we're hearing from our reps. Now, both of those situations can't be true, or can they? In order for them to be true, then I think that we've got to ask serious questions about the quality of the inspection regime in the HSE. Now, the government, after pressure from ourselves and others, including the Labour Party, gave the HSE an extra 14 million quid this year. But they couldn't use that money to bring in new inspectors because it takes years to train an inspector to be able to inspect. So they spent that money on spot checks being carried out by people who aren't qualified inspectors. So for me, that's an instant question of, how's that a good quality workplace inspection? And it isn't. They go through a fairly cursory checklist, says, have you seen the government guidance? Do you understand it? Do you follow it? Have you done a risk assessment? And if they say yes, they go, cracking, let's move on to the next workplace. So there's a real challenge about the quality of that inspection regime. There's a second question about how easy it is for the HSE to actually prosecute an employer. And we've been quite critical of as a TUC to say there hasn't been sufficient prosecution action by the HSE. But it's not all the HSE's fault. We've seen, I think as Shelley said in your opening remarks, more than 30,000 people have been fined by the police for meeting out in public when they shouldn't, for taking exercise they shouldn't, for having parties they shouldn't. All the police need to do is rock up, see that happening, and issue a fine. For a HSE to prosecute an employer, there has to be clear evidence of a material breach, there has to be an investigation, and there has to be a full judicial process supported by the Crown Prosecution Service. So it's extremely difficult for the HSE to prosecute an employer. Now, for me, that's not just a kind of strange mismatch. The government acted really quickly to give powers to the police to be able to prosecute individuals for meeting up in public, for going for those cups of coffee, for having small parties with your relatives. The government have given no extra powers of enforcement to the HSE, none. And we shouldn't be surprised about that, because for a long time, the government have been slowly strangling the HSE to be able to limit its enforcement actions and its enforcement powers, whether it's the health and safety executive or local authorities. The capacity to inspect and regulate and enforce and prosecute on health and safety has been spectacularly diminished. So there is a real challenge in how we not just hold employers to account, but actually make sure that the government are doing the right thing to enable those regulatory authorities to do that job on our behalf. I am a board member of the HSE. I talk to HSE inspectors on a regular basis. They're as committed as they ever were to hold employers to account, but they've got hands tied behind their backs and more kind of challenges in terms of the resources that they have to do that. So if there is a kind of challenge back to the government, it's to give them the same kind of flexibilities, the same kind of freedoms, and the same kind of powers that they've given to the police to arrest people for having a cup of coffee. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. Very plainly put there. It sounds like, I mean, this is the People's Assembly Against Austerity, and it sounds like it's the backdrop to all of this is austerity that's impacted on the HSE in terms of huge funding cuts, impacted on local authorities and their regulation and enforcement capacity, again with huge funding cuts over the last decade. And that is what we're seeing now, is the massive impact that's having on keeping people safe at work. I've got a question here from Lindsay, who asks, why are so many more companies demanding workers come in? And I've heard a lot of this, of people who could reasonably work from home, who are being told to come into the office or wherever to do their job. She says, is it a pursuit of profit, or is it wanting more direct control? And she references the DVLA in Swansea, where this week we saw, I think, over 500 or maybe last week, 500 cases of infections amongst the workforce there. I think one of the biggest outbreaks that we've seen. So any thoughts you've got on that? And then what I also wanted to ask was, for the members, union members, or perhaps non-union members, not members of unions yet, that are watching, what are the main things that they can be doing? What are the really basic steps that they can be doing to kind of help make their workplace safe? If they've got concerns around safety, what should they be thinking about in terms of asking their employer or organising with their colleagues?
Thanks, Shelley. Well, in response to the first one, I mean, it's very difficult to understand why employers don't feel able to support people to work from home. And we're all getting used to the technology really quickly. And in some respects, last March we were shocked into a new way of working, both in the TUC and across the economy. But I think we've learned in the last 10 months that actually, it's not really that difficult for most people who can work from home to be able to do so effectively and productively for their employer. And I think this, it reminds me of the kind of debate when flexible working was a kind of new idea, and a lot of employers had real difficulty moving away from a kind of command and control management style. If I can't see someone working and count what they're doing, then clearly they're not working. And I think that's still reflected in a lot of businesses. Of course, a lot of employers have moved in that direction and proved that it can be done, and they've had to do that really quickly. So it is just difficult to understand those employers who are trying to force people back into the workplace where they don't need to. And there is, I think, a challenge back to government on this too. The kind of Prime Minister announcing from the Downing Street briefings that people should work from home where they can, and then leaving it there without providing a kind of a bit stronger encouragement to employers to enable people to do so, I think is a bit of a cop out, really. We should be a little bit more persuasive against those employers who are not taking that option up where they can. Clearly, some people have to work, go into work. The key workers and essential workers and parts of the economy that where people can work from home, and we've got to make sure that those workplaces are as absolutely safe as they can be, which leads to your second question, Shelley. And I think, give you a plug. The resources and guides that you've put on the kind of TUC website to support workers and reps from understanding what a safe workplace looks like in the COVID environment is a good starting point for both for members, for workers, and for reps. Understand what a good COVID secure risk assessment looks like. Understand what good safety management looks like in the workplace, and importantly, to understand where there are routes for support and advice and guidance from the TUC, from their trade union, but also from the enforcement agencies like the HSE and local authorities, to make sure that those employers who aren't doing the right thing are taken to task by those enforcement agencies. So you can plug it yourself, Shelley, but it's all on the TUC website.
Thanks, Kevin. Appreciate it. Yeah, tuc.org.uk. And you can, if you're not a member of a union yet, go to that website and find out which is the best union for you to join. So worth getting that on in there. Moving on, our next speaker is himself a key worker who, as a London bus worker, has witnessed some of the worst effects of this crisis, where for months, workers working for Transport for London were battling with their employer to improve safety measures. He's a shop steward and a health and safety officer. Really pleased to be joined by Wayne Cespedes. Wayne, it's great to have you. Can you tell us a bit about your experience working in this pandemic and as a union rep as well, responding to issues on the shop floor?
Good enough to be on this program to say my piece in terms of what we've gone through this pandemic. It was scary to start with because I don't think most of us employers took that seriously, and I'm speaking on behalf of every bus driver across London and possibly across the whole country. Who are regulated and some are unregulated. We're lucky in London that we are regulated under the guise of TfL. So, our employers basically, might have wanted to do things, but, you had to get permission from TfL, in order to do them. So Unite tripartite committee led by Joe Murphy, asked the shop stewards basically to formulate plans and proposals to put forward to take to TfL because we're on the front line. We see what's happening every day. There were people dying all around us. I mean, I, for one, who had a colleague who passed away within a matter of 10 days. It was shocking. It was disturbing for everyone. People start panicking, basically, what's really happening. But we progressed and, we made significant progress. I mean, try forcing TfL's hand to implement these things across the companies. And us as shop stewards were given the responsibility to be stood down permanently to sort of implement all the necessary steps and measures that were put in place. The conveners were negotiating with companies to see what staff who had medical conditions and those who could have attained letters from the NHS to prove that they had underlying conditions so they could become part of this furlough scheme. And while doing so, it was, where do we stand? I mean, we're in the open. We have to mix with the public. Who are the people who's going to be mostly affected? And that's going to be us because of the things that we, set out for us to do. Closing off the front doors, putting screen protectors in. Some companies were trying to do it on the cheap, to get away with it. If they could get a curtain to put up to blind you off, they would have done it. But however, we managed to get stuffs in place and gradually, we've made, significant progress. It was tough going. Overnight we became advisors, medical assistants, semi-pro lawyers because of all the information and questions that members were asking you, who qualifies for this, who doesn't qualify for that, what would they need to do, and we had to have regular meetings. And at one stage, obviously, like where we are today, who knew that we as shop stewards we're going to have meetings online because we can't meet together to put stuffs together and have verbal conversations. Of course, lockdown came and passengers numbers were reduced, and people were still getting on, and not a lot of people didn't take it serious at all. Wearing masks is one of those things where a lot of people don't believe in. I'm pleased now that we with the pressure we put on TfL, that they're not promoting it, that masks are mandatory on public transport, and yet there are people who still try to flout the rules. Who's there to police it? Then there's not enough police out there to police it, and we as drivers, we're not going to take that responsibility, because it was only during this pandemic that we were given key worker status, and everyone was happy to wave to you, like clapping for the nurses every Thursday. We as drivers were looked upon and thought, brilliant, you're taking you're driving London around. 2 weeks later down the line, after everything has unfolded, I mean, you're still being spat at. It was tough. This sector of lockdown, I'm not sure really it is lockdown at all. It doesn't feel like it, because the amount of people who are traveling on public transport, we have restricted numbers. Yes, you can, as a driver, you can say, you can only take a certain amount of passengers depending on the type of buses that you drive. But there's some people out there who are so ignorant, and we can't police that at all. So the abuse comes, and you take it as it is. As low-paid workers with very little going, the companies exploited that. We were given horrible schedules, to work and stuff like that. But people needed to be in jobs, so you got no choice. You just have to do it. We're where we are now, and we're still on our full-time stand down. We're doing what we're doing. We're making good progress. Unite has been very supportive. I mean, TfL has changed its mantra on a lot of things. A lot of companies are coming on board and doing what they've got to do. We as reps in the garage will identify all the necessary changes that is needed to be made in order to safeguard, our workforce. And as it stands, it's on track. We are doing fine, and hopefully, during this pandemic, we can carry out the great and good work that was expected of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wayne, for that. I'm sorry to hear about your colleague who you lost early on in the pandemic, and also all the anecdotes about spitting and refusing to wear masks and stuff like that is absolutely appalling, the kind of abuse and working conditions that you and your colleagues have had to experience. We've had a few questions specifically to you. I just want to ask you one of them before we go on to our final speaker. And it's Tony, he asks about public sector ownership of its core. And I know you work for a private bus company, but obviously it is contracted through Transport for London. He also talks about zero COVID. What difference do you think that would make, bringing the bus services into public ownership?
It's a brilliant idea, and it's something that has been flouted, amongst us as reps on numerous occasions, and we've had several conversations in regards to that. If it was brought back into public ownership, would there be better control? Would your job situations be any different? The answer is I possibly don't know, because you really would have proper management at the top. And yes, the infrastructure as it stands, there's money to be made out of it. Would that then be invested back into the system? And that would create a rolling thing going forward. As it stands, I'm not sure what party or what government is going to allow that to happen. And it's a good idea, it's a good projection, and I think one of the things that would possibly allow for that to happen, if we get unions working together, and everyone unite as one, then the option is there for it to work. But if we can't do that, then obviously I don't think we're going to move forward at all. We're still being private ownership, for a long time to come. And one of the things is that, schedules is a big thing at the moment with these companies, because it's all about milking all the blood they can get out of you, in terms of the hours of that you have to work, and the extras that they try to minimize what they could pay you. I mean, all of that. I mean, I had a joys of looking at a schedule today, and I was absolutely gobsmacked by some of the schedules that you know, the company is putting out there. And this is all due to COVID, and they do it under the guise that, you know, it's a request from TfL that, you know, these are the schedules that they are allowed to put in, and it's all based on contract prices, and whatever they can exploit out of it, because every company, I understand every company is here to make money, but it's us as the lower paid drivers basically who are disadvantaged, because where you could earn $1 or $2, or I can see that's not moving away. How do we fight against that? I mean, we will have to unite as a group in order to push this message across to all the individuals or drivers across the different companies. Because, you know, you look in London and, you know, you see a red bus driving down the road. They're all not the same. They're all on the TfL, but they all have little logos on the side of them, and they are competitors. So, you know, if a route is up for tender, someone's going to fight for that, and they would put the lowest bid in, knowing that it's going to be a struggle for them to maintain it, but they will take it if they can't run the service that they promise to offer. And this is where the problem comes in. If all of these people from these companies decide that, you know, we can do it, we as bus drivers across London will have to come together as one, and we can fight the fight. And hopefully we will be able to do it. And if we can, we will rejoice, because we could go back into public ownership. Thank you.
I like the fighting talk. Thanks, Wayne. It's interesting you mentioned about to work longer hours and shifts in this pandemic, because that links back to what Roger was talking about at the beginning. You know, the strain this is having on people's mental health. Yeah. And obviously, I know working hours for bus drivers, particularly, has long been a concern. And I hope that, if anything, that this pandemic has brought workplace health and safety into many more people's minds. And I just want to thank you, because the work you've been doing as a health and safety rep, you talked about some of the improvements that you've forced the employer to make on the buses, because it clearly has helped a lot of people with their health and safety, but it's probably also saved lives. And the work that union health and safety reps have been doing throughout this pandemic is absolutely heroic. Helen has just written down here, brave reps like Wayne are like gold dust. And it's absolutely true. If anyone's watching tonight and you're a union member and you haven't got a health and safety rep in your workplace, please consider becoming one, because it is the most important role in this movement. Now moving on to our final speaker, who is a fantastic voice for working people in Parliament, a Labour MP who represents the Salford and Eccles constituency, Rebecca Long-Bailey, or RLB as she's effectively.
Thanks, Shelley. It's an absolute pleasure to be following such fantastic speakers tonight who've been really fighting on the front line in this crisis, quite frankly. And sadly, the message that we seem to have got from government right throughout the crisis has been very much that it's a case of health and safety versus the health of the economy. Now, safety should have always been the priority, and we should have been provided with the economic support to keep people home in those early days, but it didn't happen. I know in my own constituency, when we had the first lockdown, which was far more severe, I think, than where we are at the moment, there were still people going into factories and onto building sites and compromising their own health and safety. There were still self-employed people who had to choose between keeping a livelihood or losing their income and potentially their homes. They had to make that agonising decision, and that should not have been the situation. And sadly, the reality is that aside from the heartbreak of unnecessary and avoidable COVID deaths, is that by compromising on that safety in the workplace, we're actually increasing the damage that's being done to our economy by prolonging the intensity of transmission of COVID within our communities. Now, on health and safety within workplaces, I understand that there's 8 workplace sector guides at the moment for employers to ensure that they're supposedly COVID secure. And they've all got the same template guidance under managing risk. And in that, there's a statement that says, the government is clear that workers should not be forced into an unsafe work environment. Well, that sounds good, doesn't it? But how does that actually work in practice? How does it work in a busy workplace, in a factory, in a mail sorting office, in a bus depot, as we've heard, or indeed in a classroom full of 4 and 5-year-olds? Now, we've seen what happened with schools. The warnings were there, the science was clear, the government ignored it, and we saw an increase in community transmission, as well as a compromising of safety of all staff that were working within schools. Now, it's important to know, and this was highlighted in the schools crisis by some of our trade unions, that all workers are supposed to be able to rely on Section 44 of the Employment Rights Act 1996, which allows all those in serious and imminent danger, or who subjectively believe that others are in danger, to leave the workplace and to bring a claim for unfair dismissal if they're sacked as a result. But with trade union representation so sparse in many workplaces, and workers' rights denied to many gig and insecure workers, and most staff, with rights, fearful in most workplaces of losing their jobs due to economic uncertainty, I doubt that we're going to see a raft of claims under this banner. Indeed, even with the schools crisis itself, we still saw some workplaces and their reps putting in a Section 44 letter to their employers, but a lot of them didn't, because they were fearful of what might happen and that they would be targeted as a result. Now, equally, I'm not happy that the government is pulling out all the stops in terms of its workplace guidance to ensure that workplaces are COVID secure. And there's an important document that I'm sure a lot of people on this call have already read, that was put together by Independent Sage and the Hazards Campaign. And what they did was put together a charter for safe workplaces in the pandemic. But they also set out that safety is one step to take. But overall, throughout this crisis, it was already endangered by the gig economy, by precarity, by structural inequalities, low pay, lack of sick pay, 0-hour contracts, and just a complete disregard for the law by some employers. Now, I'm sure we're all in agreement that COVID safety can't be taken for granted or left to the discretion of individual enterprises. And at the moment, it's not guaranteed by robust enough legal principles or policies. So, for example, there's no workplace sign-off process, there's no checks or balances, and sadly, as we know, for every good employer, there's a bad one who'll wantonly flout the health and safety of their workforce. Now, we've had a fantastic contribution already highlighting the state of affairs at the HSE, and certainly two such bodies that should be playing a huge role in monitoring workplaces are local authorities and the Health and Safety Executive. But after 10 years of cuts and chronic underfunding, both are running on a skeleton. Independent Sage reported in July 2020, there were just 390 Band 3 full-time equivalent HSE inspectors for the whole of the United Kingdom, and the number of full-time equivalent local authority health and safety inspectors fell from 1,020 in 2010 to just half, 543 in 2017. So it's unlikely that many workplaces, even in normal times, could expect a visit in the next 50 years, let alone immediately, as they're required now. It's also worrying, and we've heard this from Wayne as well, that issues go way beyond the workplace, but they affect every workplace and its safety. And they're not being considered, such as crowded public transport. We've all seen the photos on Twitter of this supposed lockdown and the crowded platforms and bus stops across the United Kingdom. Now, as well as the individual inspection situation, the Independent Sage report also stated that the HSE and local authorities should look at publishing weekly figures on how many inspections they've carried out, where they've issued enforcement notices, and the number of reported COVID incidents, deaths and illnesses under the Reporting of Injuries, Diseases and Dangerous Occurrences Regulation, RIDDOR 2013. Because underreporting of infection and indeed death means, and this is definitely happening, but it means that we've lost complete control of the situation. Now that's just one small snapshot of an issue that the government must address when it comes to workplace safety. But wider than all of this, and I think this has been highlighted by all of the speakers tonight, is the strengthening of workers' rights and trade union representation as a real on-the-ground protection for workers. We're not anywhere near this at the moment, and unfortunately everything I've heard from government so far, it does suggest that they're balancing the health and safety of workers with the health of the economy, and neither are going to win unless something changes. And the sad thing, without protecting the health of workers, the economic effects of COVID are going to be far more damaging and long lasting. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Becky, for joining us tonight for that really thorough contribution. I just want to pick up, you mentioned at the end there, workers' rights in general. And we've seen this week, the government announced they're going to be doing a review of workers' rights post-Brexit. That now seems to have been a U-turn on that just today. What do you expect us to see in the coming weeks and months with regards to workers' rights? And what can we as activists, trade union members, be doing to try and stop them in their tracks?
We're already seeing the beginnings of an assault on our rights at work, and that's been exemplified by a lot of the debate around fire and rehire. We know that there's a lot of unscrupulous employers that are using the pandemic as an excuse to force their employees onto worse terms and conditions. And I think it's going to create a culture of fear. And there's already a culture of fear in many workplaces because we're facing one of the worst recessions that we've ever seen, and people are desperate to keep hold of their jobs. But that will make it less likely for them to raise issues about health and safety. And that worries me significantly. So people are worried about losing their jobs. They're going to have their terms and conditions eroded under the banner of fire and rehire, and they're going to compromise their safety. So I think it's so important for us across the movement to speak in political terms about what's happening, but also to organise, because as you said yourself, Shelley, now is the most important time to start asking people to be health and safety representatives at work, to encourage colleagues to join a trade union, because if we don't make sure that we're there fighting for people, then in the blink of an eye, in the next 12 months, we could have lost many of our protections, because I don't believe for a second that the government has done a U-turn on this erosion of workers' rights. I think it's been shelved for the time being. And as we know, they'll do it in a piecemeal way, one little bit at a time, so that people don't realise that their rights are trickling away.
Yeah, absolutely. We need to be prepared. We need to organise, as you say. If you're watching on Facebook, please do post some questions to the panel in the comments section, because I can see them and I'll put them to. We've only got a few more minutes. I just wanted to flag very quickly, tonight's broadcast is called Dying to Work, and that's not to be confused with an existing health campaign run by the TUC, which is calling for better protection for terminally ill workers from being dismissed by their employers. You can find out more about that campaign from the TUC's website. There's one question from Tony. We've had a lot of talk about the health and safety executive, particularly from Kevin and Rebecca. And Tony asks, should the HSE do more? It has the power to prosecute. We've heard that it hasn't prosecuted anyone over COVID, but how can we force it to take its legal responsibilities seriously? Kevin, can I come to you on that one first, please?
Yeah, sure. Well, as I said, I do genuinely think that the health and safety executive does take its responsibilities seriously, is extremely committed to enforcing health and safety at work, and health and safety inspectors, good prospect members, and they're all experts in their field. I think they genuinely do a fantastic job. Where we've seen in pre-pandemic reports from the HSE shows that they're incredibly effective at identifying and challenging breaches of health and safety, around about a 50% return rate on their inspection activity. I think the point I was trying to make in my remarks is that there's a huge contrast between how easy it is for police to prosecute individuals who are not socially distancing, who are not following the rules. For the HSE to prosecute an employer who's doing exactly the same thing, there has to be an investigation, there has to be proof of negligence, there has to be a case brought to the Criminal Prosecution Service, and they have to decide whether it's got a reasonable chance of getting through the judicial system. Now, that's like a whole series of hoops that just don't apply to the enforcement in public settings by the police. And in this particular environment, it's just not practicable to kind of address and arrest the kind of scale of the pandemic growth with those kind of barriers to get through and those processes and procedures to get through. So I don't think it's a HSE, if you like, a challenge, although, you know, we all make sure that the HSE does as much as it possibly can. It's a systemic challenge which is facilitated by the government for 10 years, increasingly strangling the HSE's capacity to operate in that space. So, you know, let's make sure we know where the problem is and direct our fight to that problem. And it's a way in which the government has constrained both local authorities through austerity and the HSE from carrying out that regulatory and enforcement function.
Thanks, Kevin. I'm glad that Rebecca echoed my call for more people to become safety reps. And Wayne, since you are one, I just wanted to ask you, you know, what is the benefit of being a safety rep? Have you seen in the last year or whatever, more people coming forward to become health and safety reps? What can we do to encourage more people to take on the role that you have?
Then some of
You're still muted, I'm afraid. There we go.
Am I on? Yes. Right. As I said, it's a bit of a challenge, and obviously, employers, as it stands, don't really want to have health and safety reps in garages, basically, or workplaces on a whole, and it's purely because they don't consider the position on a whole to be of any substance to them, and that then sort of gives them the power to, you know, break rules as much as they possibly can because there's no one around to enforce it. For us as Unite, basically our reps are health and safety reps, and that's something like, you know, allows you to get around that sort of a settings that they've got in place. You know, I think if people really are interested and want to be health and safety reps, get trained up, put your name forward, and I'm sure, I mean, you know, if you're willing to stand up against your employer, you've got a chance. You know, and it's great for all of the health and safety reps that we've got around who stand up to employers and point out to them what they're doing wrong, what they need to do, how we can provide a safe and better workplace for their staff. And I think that is the way forward. It's bravery. Come forward, get signed up with Unite, you know, get trained up, get your recognition, get stamped in your workplace. You start telling your employers what they need to change, how they can change it, and what's the best way to do it going forward.
Thanks, Wayne. And echoing that, a comment from Derek here says, I'm working at home now, thanks to some fantastic help from my union health and safety officer and a threat of formal action against a group of managers, solidarity. And they're the kind of stories that we're hearing across the movement is, you know, unions are stepping in to protect members. We've only got a few minutes left now, so I just want to come back to all of you for any closing remarks, thoughts, comments, or ideas for anyone watching tonight, whether they're going into work as a key worker or they might be working from home. What kind of things should they be thinking about? What kind of action should they be taking? How can they get more involved in the movement and thinking about putting themselves forward and so on? Kevin, if I can come to you first.
Thanks, Shelley. Well, I think, first of all, echo the points that everyone's making around a unionised workplace being twice as safe as any other workplace. Be a rep, the support there from your union. Fantastic quality advice and guidance from Shelley and the TUC. It's a great role to play. There's lots of advice and guidance there for people to look at to see what the conditions of their workplace should be in COVID. But the best way to secure those conditions is to organise at work.
Absolutely spot on. Thanks, Kevin. Rebecca, if I can come to you.
Thanks, Shelley. I think I'd just add to what Kevin said, because organisation obviously is one of the key pillars, but The second key pillar is developing the economic strategy. One of the things that I think is clear from this crisis, I think it was probably clear to everybody on this call way before it, is that our economic model is not fit for purpose. It wasn't there to provide the safety net that people needed when we went into this crisis. It didn't give them the economic security that they deserved. And as we come out of the crisis, we're going to see an epidemic of long-term unemployment from people who have lost their jobs. And it will take time to rebuild the economy, develop industrial strategies, have a green industrial revolution if we can manage to get the government to do that. I'll hold my breath on that. But we have to have a strategy in the interim to look after people. So we've got to start developing as a movement the arguments for things like universal basic income, public ownership of key utilities, and a complete restructuring of our economic framework so that they work for our communities again. I don't have long enough to go into detail about what that means, and I'm sure everybody on this call's got those ideas themselves. But now it has never been more important to make those arguments.
Absolutely. Wayne, any closing remarks from you? You need to unmute yourself again, I'm afraid, comrade.
Sometime this week was debating, the working time directive. I mean, on the back of Brexit, I think that would be absolutely detrimental to a lot of employees out there. A lot of businesses could exploit that very much, and I think we need to join forces as unions to fight this, because it's not only that we're in a pandemic. Getting rid of the working time directive is going to be a bigger pandemic for workforce, because I think we're going to work until we die then, because you will have no rights at all. I mean, you've got no holidays. Any free time you have, within work will be taken away. And that is something that we have to fight against, because, I mean, that's going to be real complacency. And obviously, as it stands, we fight against fatigue in the workplace at the moment. Where we're asking employers to reduce the amount of time, people are at work. That will only increase it. That's my final thing. And the other thing is, I know it's a thing at the moment where, my sort of people are against, the opportunity or, the advice given about taking a vaccine. I think that's one thing we should think about really hard. That if you want to save a life, if you want to protect your family, there will be a vaccine. And when my time comes, I'm definitely going to be taking one. Thank you.
Thank you, Wayne. That's such a good note to end on. And what I've been saying is that to make sure everybody's as safe as possible at work, we need workplaces that are unionised, organised and immunised. We're in this for the long haul. I'm so grateful to everybody who has joined us tonight, who's watching at home. We've been posting it in the comments, but please do sign up for the People's Assembly newsletter on the website. Keep up to date with all the current actions and events like this, peoplesassembly.org.uk. Thank you to Wayne, Rebecca, Kevin, and obviously Roger before he had to leave us. It's a really interesting discussion. I'm so grateful, and stay safe, everybody.